Before I take Suella Braverman's latest hatred to pieces, let me just begin by clarifying something. I don't believe there is any such thing as a decent Conservative politician. A certain type of Liberal tries to conjure up the whole decent Tory thing now and then. Basically, when some Tory MP says, well, actually, I think the King Herod policy of killing all newborns is a bit unseemly, a bit rich for my tastes. And then we get all this, well, it's great to see there are some decent Tories out there who are willing to stick their heads above the parapet. And then the Tory goes and votes for the King Herod bill. And they're like, oh, how disappointing. So that notwithstanding, while there might not be any, in my view, decent Tory MPs, given the horrendous policies that they voted for over the last 13 years, some are clearly a lot worse than others. Truly, we are blessed with a spectrum ranging from influenza to bubonic plague. Now, the worst of the whole lot, in my view, has to be Suella Braverman. Who I refuse to actually believe exists. She's a disturbing parody of a pantomime villain for whom cruelty appears to be an end in itself. Now, today she did a tour of TV studios. Let's just have a little listen to what she had to say.
What's clear is that what we've seen is a practice whereby vulnerable white English girls, sometimes in care, sometimes who are in challenging circumstances, being pursued and raped and drugged and harmed by gangs of British Pakistani men who've worked in child abuse rings or networks. We've seen institutions and state agencies, whether it's social workers, teachers, the police, turn a blind eye to these signs of abuse out of political correctness, out of fear of being called racist, out of fear of being called bigoted. And as a result, thousands, we're not talking small numbers, we're talking large numbers, thousands of children have had their childhoods robbed and devastated. And there are many of these perpetrators still running wild, behaving in this way. And it's now down to the authorities to track these perpetrators down without fear or favour, relentlessly, and bring them to justice.
Okay, so here's she talking about vulnerable white girls being targeted by British Pakistani grooming gangs. Now, that is the sort of thing you would have expected to read in BNP leaflets, and which not that long ago would actually have been condemned by Tory and Labour politicians alike. But we are in 2023 in the worst possible timeline. It's not true. It's really important to make this very, very clear. It isn't true. According to a Home Office report in 2020, the majority of child sexual abuse gangs are made up of white men under 30. The media focuses on high-profile cases in Rotherham and Telford, which have bred the idea that it's British Asian men predominantly driving this abuse. But they can find no conclusive evidence that black and Asian offenders were overrepresented compared to the national populations. And the Home Office report found that 92% of defendants were from white ethnic backgrounds. Now, what Braverman is doing is tapping into a prejudice based on a myth, which has become widespread thanks to a toxic racist media, and which directly feeds a racist narrative that British Asian men of Pakistani origin are sexual predators targeting white girls. And there's a long history of this, the whole idea of the person of colour who is the men of colour who are targeting innocent white girls. We saw that, for example, in the United States. The Ku Klux Klan were in large amount founded on the basis that black men were preying on white girls. There was a disturbing film called Birth of a Nation, which really played on that idea and helped fuel the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, this isn't the only trope which Suella Braverman has been on TV promoting. Let's just hear what else she had to say.
Have you changed your mind? I do believe that we have, the high levels of the high numbers of people coming in through work and study routes is high. It places pressure on housing and accommodation supply. It places pressure on school places, on health services. Those are reasonable concerns, and we need to make sure that we're getting the balance right.
Well, this is a classic of the genre, isn't it? Which is you blame refugees and migrants for problems and crises caused by the Tories. Now, take housing. Let's think about the housing crisis. Now, council housing was flogged off because of right to buy, where it was sold off and the stock not replaced. 40% of the council homes flogged off are now rented out by buy-to-let landlords, charging rents on average twice as much as they would be if they were still in the social sector. At the same time, Thatcherism led to a collapse in public house building, which shamefully New Labour did not correct, because New Labour in lots of ways upheld the Thatcherite political and economic consensus. We hear a lot, by the way, there's not enough space to build, we're only a tiny island. It's actually estimated that only about 1.4% of the total land surface of the UK is actually even built on. Indeed, according to the Ordnance Survey data, buildings cover less of Britain than the land that's revealed when the tide goes out each day. Now, the point is that governments starting with Thatcherism abdicated their responsibilities to provide housing to the market, and the market has failed to deliver. And we have this massive housing crisis as a consequence. Now, as we know, house prices have surged, pricing younger people out. The council housing isn't there because it was flogged off, and what's left is residualised. It's basically kept for those who are most in need. And then we have a rip-off private renter sector where you have tenants in London, for example, paying an average of 40% of their pay on renting. None of this housing crisis is caused by migrants or refugees in the slightest. It's caused by government policy. Now, Braverman mentions pressure on schools. Let's look at the facts here again. Let's look at Tory vandalism. According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, school spending per pupil in 2023 is set to be 3% lower than 2010 levels when you factor in the actual costs faced by schools. In the first decade of Tory rule, real terms school spending per pupil fell by 9%. Now, I use the word vandalism because it is vandalism. That's an attack on the potential of the next generation. And it's also what's known as a false economy. That's where you make cuts on the basis you're making savings, but actually you end up paying more as a consequence. Because obviously, if you don't invest in the next generation, realising their potential, then the economy and society and our culture will not thrive in the same way, obviously. I mean, should be obvious, shouldn't it? But not to our overlords. I mean, the point then she made about the National Health Service, which is propped up, by the way, without foreign-born nurses and doctors, it would collapse like that. Now, first, you had under David Cameron and George Osborne the longest squeeze in the NHS budget as a proportion of the economy since its founding back in the 1940s. They scrapped the nurses' bursary. Do you remember that? Back in 2016. They presided over a massive staffing crisis with about 50,000 nurses in England alone, nursing posts unfilled. About 10% of the NHS staffing not there. One big contributing factor, of course, is the real terms pay cuts that staff have suffered. Nurses pay down by an average of over £5,000 in real terms since 2010 when the Tories came to power. For paramedics, £6,700 worse off than they were in 2010 in real terms. Now, all of that is obviously driving a retention of recruitment crisis, which is partly being filled, by the way, by nurses and doctors from other countries. So rather than the NHS being undermined and put under pressure, actually partly because of the recruitment crisis, because of things like cutting the nurses' bursary, we've had to rely instead of on the labour of people from other countries. So, I mean, it's just a nonsense in every level. It's also true, by the way, and I didn't even talk about marketisation and privatisation and how that's undermined the NHS and money which should be spent on patient care going to private companies. But furthermore, another point is that migrants tend to be younger and therefore have less health needs. So they actually provide, on average, less pressure to the NHS because you tend to have fewer older migrants, say pensioners, far less, who are more likely to need the NHS. But they are likely to go into work and pay taxes. So in that sense, you get an immigration dividend where you get those migrants paying in more than they get back from the state, which is obviously completely missing from this so-called conversation. Not that it's a healthy or balanced conversation. It's obviously about whipping up some of the worst elements of the human character for the cynical, partisan and electoral gains of the Conservative Party. It's not people arriving in this country, migrants and refugees, that's the problem. It's the Conservatives decimating our services. And what they want you to do is blame migrants and refugees for the fact that the Tories didn't spend properly on the NHS and put more pressure on the NHS by not dealing with the social care crisis, that they didn't build the housing that we need, that they let private rents soar, house prices obviously pricing a generation out, that they slashed real term spending on education. These are all problems which people should be angry about. They should be angry at public services that are overstretched. But why are they overstretched? Because of the policies of the Conservatives. Now, the scapegoating of the foreigner for the problems caused by the powerful is one of the ugliest, oldest tricks in the right-wing playbook. That you don't hold the powerful to account, but instead you blame often very desperate people. That's what this is about. I don't think it's going to work in the way that the Tories hope it will. It will appeal to a section of the population, unquestionably. But this is desperation because the Tories have presided and entrenched a broken economic system, which is great if you're rich and powerful, but for millions of people has become a complete nightmare. And they want people to blame that nightmare on anyone but them, and particularly people who are vulnerable, marginalised, and who lack a voice, who are less able to defend themselves against the libels thrown their way by the Conservatives. But we do need to speak the truth. And what Suella Braverman has propagated is a nonsense which is based on hatred and lies and needs to be exposed as such. Please like and subscribe and do support us on patreon.com/. See you in a bit.